Maurizio Bussolo. Welcome to Advocata Studio. Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about your personal story?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Very appreciated. Okay, my personal story. I'm Italian. I come from Torino, northwest, close to France, and I left Italy probably middle of my life to do my postgraduate studies in the UK, and then I moved Warwick University. Warwick University, and I moved during my PhD. One interesting thing is that I was there during the post Thatcher period, so the whole Midlands, where it's very near Coventry, which was an industrial core of England, was completely deindustrialized. And so it was desolate. There was nothing to do really apart from studying. But I moved to the OECD in Paris for a summer job, and then I stayed a couple of years there. Then I was kicked out, went back to finish my PhD, and then I decided to have a go. My PhD was on a trade agreement. It was again the period in which NAFTA was signed between North America or US, Canada, and Mexico. And I did a similar study for the North Africa and Europe. So I wanted an experience in a developing country, so I moved to Colombia after I finished my PhD in South America. And there I met my wife, and we decided to move back to Europe. And I went to ODI, Overseas Development Institute in London, which in a period where Claire Short was the first secretary of DFID, the Department for International Development, that now is called differently. But she had an interest in trade and poverty. They wrote the first white paper on trade and poverty. So I began to be interested in topics related to trade and the impact on income distribution and poverty. And after London, we moved back to Paris. I worked a little bit again at the OECD. And then 20 years or so ago, I was asked to interview for the World Bank, and I moved back to DC. And so I'm at the World Bank. I've been there for a long period of time, about 23 years now. So recently, one of my vice president asked me, "How many years have you been at the bank?" And I said, "More than 20." And he said, "Well, you're doomed. When you go beyond 20 years, you learn a very important skill, very useful skill, but it become a little less marketable outside." Anyway, the work at the World Bank is very interesting. I've worked in DEC, the Development Economics, which is the center of knowledge for the bank, doing research. Then I moved in Latin America for a while, where I was doing actual operational work during the 2008-9 financial crisis. So it was a tough time. So countries needed quite a bit of financial help. And then I moved back to the center, and then I've been in two chief economists in Europe and Central Asia, and then last 4 years in South Asia, which is a very interesting region, very difficult to say many new things, because it's a region perhaps because of the English language and the richness in data, and the large population of the region is a very well studied region, very good economists from the region and outside that are focused on the region. So it's been an interesting 4 years for me. I do some teaching. I also, when I can, I've been invited professor in a few universities in Italy, in France, and the UK. So that's my story. I have two daughters. So I have been also recently, partly because of it's one of the important issue for the region. Gender inequality is also one thing that I'm quite interested in.
So that's a very rich set of experiences that you have, and that probably set the foundation basically for a richer discussion. You have just released this report basically, and you have given this presentation summarizing some of the key findings. In that, you say that the growth across South Asia is slowing. What is the main reason for the slowdown?
Well, okay, so it's it's a complex complex question that, but I would say that there are both cyclical and structural reasons behind this slowdown. Let's start with maybe with the structural, and let's take a step back and look at the overall global growth. There's another report done by two colleagues of mine, Ayan Koz and Francisca Onsorge, and others, on growth potential in the world. And one of the headline of their large report is that the world is going to have weak growth for at least another 5 to 10 years. So we moved from all the factors that have helped in the 90s and early 2000 and even before to boost growth, trade liberalization, increase globalization in terms of technology and exchange of capital, etc. Have been sort of exhausted. So the world was growing in about the potential growth as the world was 3.6 in the last 10 years before the change of the millennium. Then it went to 2.6, and the forecast in there, according to their report, is going to be 2.2. So these are secular trend. Globalization, technology is one. Another important one is demography. So there has been aging in across the world. It's not really an important problem for this region, but China, Europe, and other countries have been undergoing this change in demography. So all of these put pressure on future growth. Then you add on top of that, you add more cyclical issues, and we have had several coming online recently. The COVID is obviously still very clear in our memory, but geopolitical tensions, the wars in Ukraine, Gaza, and Israel, and that is enlarging and taking other parts of the regions in this. Are all the tightening of the Fed, inflation, all related, and all these cyclical forces are also affecting the short term. So for these are the set of reasons that are headwinds that the countries have to face in the near future, and in some sense for the longer future. There are also opportunities, though, and it's not all doom and gloom. As I mentioned in the presentation, the energy transition can be seen as, again, a possibility of refurbishing the economy, changing the way things are done, and people are realizing that is not really an option anymore, and that the climate change that I haven't mentioned is also another structural change that is going to be becoming important and potentially a headwind in the future.
In your presentation, you also highlight that the slowdown in China,
Yes.
which perhaps is structural reasons, and then they have had this huge property bubble,
Yes.
but it will have an impact on South Asia. I was wondering, considering that South Asia has very limited exports to China.
Yes.
I think the highest I saw was with Pakistan, close to about 9%.
Right.
India was more like 6%, and everybody else was low single digit. Why is a slowdown in China going to impact growth in South Asia? Is it first order effects or second order effect?
No, it's you're right to point out that the first order, the direct linkages in terms of trade flows are not that high, and in a way that is both an advantage in the sense that it insulates the region from these shocks, but it's also a disadvantage because of it insulates the region from flows of trade, but also capital, and therefore also ideas, technology, etc. So the issue of China is again probably better observed, better discussed in terms of these global trends and longer term structural change. So in the 90s, again going back to what I was saying, in the 90s, basically China, Russia, India entered the WTO, and among them, probably a billion or close to a billion workers became connected, some more than others, to the global system of trade. Before that, there was some calculation where that the world was again at 1 billion global workers. By global means workers that work in tradable sectors. So the global labor market went from 1 billion to 2 billion, and that change has created issues of inequality in high-income countries, because these new billion of workers came with less capital to work with and lower education, and so the type of trades of goods that they were producing were intensive of low skills, and that has created a pressure in high-income countries, because high-skill workers in high-income countries didn't have a competition, but low-skill, and so this has increased inequality in these countries, and one reaction has been to slap tariffs across. So there has been all disruption of trade. Now, going back to China, again, you saw with the COVID and with nearshoring, the fact that countries want to have control over certain production. So there has been all these reshoring. So China going down, maybe it's not so important for Sri Lanka and South Asia, but all these convulsion at the global level have an impact. The availability, and potentially positive, because maybe again, in the short term there is a little bit downturn, but in longer term, these are considered more friendly places than other places, so there is more interest in intensifying the trade relations, and so it's. I would agree with you on my long answer. I would agree with you that maybe it's not so crucial in terms of longer term. There is a bit of an effect in the short term, but these other issues are more important.
Also, South Asia historically does not have a lot of intra-regional trade.
Right.
I remember seeing somewhere like only 5%, while in ASEAN it's like 25-30%.
Right.
You have any comments on that?
Yeah, well, there is a whole group in my vice presidency interested in boosting intra-regional trade and considering trade within the region an important engine of development and growth. If you look at the experience of Europe, where I come from, the creation of the common market was one important tool that was created after the war to create peace, and people that do business together, they don't want to fight with each other, right? So there is that view also that we hold, that we would like the region to do more of that. So there are some political issues again that keep the countries separate. There are issues of transport and logistics that are difficult. That it's easier to fly out of India or Sri Lanka to Dubai than to fly to other countries within the region. So there are those issues that are to consider, and and no, yes. So it's a missed opportunity, and there should be more focus on that. One thing that I can say is that just before a week ago, I was in the 20th edition of the SAESM, the South Asia Economic Students Meet. It's something that we co-finance with others, and it's a meet of 3-4 days of students from all over South Asia countries. And so you have, they present papers, they are undergraduate, they present papers to each other, there are competitions, etc. And it's amazing to see Pakistani and Indians working together on something, presenting together, and some of the older students that come back to organize that, they say that their experience they carry it with them, and the hope is that in 20 years or maybe less, when they are in position of powers, they remember each other and they can collaborate more. So that's the idea.
That makes a lot of sense. Um, in your presentation, you also showcase that few countries in South Asia actually are becoming more protectionist. There are capital controls, there are trade restrictions on items. We have seen that in Sri Lanka itself because of an extreme shortage of dollars. Why do these countries resort to them when they are having balance of payment crisis, when it should be a more fiscal or monetary response?
Right. Well, three quick reasons. One is speed. It's quite effective. These measures are quite effective when you are in an emergency mode. You can use these, and they have an almost immediate effect, even if it's not the best way to go about, as you point out. One is that is a bit more politically easier, populistic in a way, because you are kind of blaming the external forces. We isolate ourselves from the rest. We put a tariff on imports, so thinking that the cost of that is on the external, and you protect your reserves. And the third one is perhaps also a constraint on capacity. There is conducting good fiscal and monetary policy requires not only skillful minister or talented people, which you certainly have, but it's a whole series of data monitoring. If you look at how the Fed is conducting their policy, they are fed with constant flow of data. And the infrastructure of data, the transparency of data, the reliability of data in developing countries is just not there. So there are multiple reasons why these are second order policy tools, but that they tend to be used.
Um, I looked at some of the data that the Asian Productivity Organization puts out, uh, and they have a clear relationship about the contribution total factor productivity is making to growth. And this looks like a South Asian phenomenon, that it has a very, very low contribution, and in the last few years, even a negative contribution. So it seems like the growth is coming via factor accumulation. Um, but as we know, that's not good growth. Ideally, you want a larger contribution coming from total factor productivity. Have you looked into this issue?
Yes, some of it, because I've worked on another publication on informality in the region, an edited volume with my colleague Siddharth Sharma. It's called Hidden Potential, by the way. So our view of informality is not so negative, but we look at adoption of technology from firms, and the differences between informal and formal firms, So start from the observation that a firm in South Asia takes twice or sometimes even 5 more years, no, 5 more times to double in size vis-a-vis a Mexican firm or vis-a-vis a US firm. So there is firms tend to grow very slowly, and we know that small firms have liquidity constraint, have knowledge constraint, and adopting better technologies is difficult, and they don't, and that is one of the reasons why TFP is not expanding so strongly. But it's not the fault of the firms themselves. Is they operate in a fairly distorted economy with many different type of distortions from the fiscal, from the tax, from the subsidy, and so there are many different issues that slow down the TFP. But let me say one other important issue there, which is somehow I and others remain a little bit dissatisfied with the way this growth accounting is done, and TFP becomes one container of everything we don't know, we can't explain very well. And so if this goes up or down, we say, oh, it's bad, but we don't know very well what is happening there. And there is an important lesson on this from a recent study done by Issier et al. in US. They look at the growth rate of the US from the 60s to 2010, 15, more than 50 years of growth. And they start from this point that in the 60s, all 96%, 93%, 94% were white men in professions like doctors, lawyers, or managers. So white men were dominating all these high-level occupations, okay? And it's impossible, their premise is it's impossible that all the talent for doing these professions is in white men. And so what they do is they create a fairly sophisticated model where they look at how talent has become much more equally distributed in these 60 years. And they look at the 2010, where these white men in these professions became 60, 61, 58, so much more equally. And the other group that enter the labor market are women. So there has been an increase, a large amount of female labor force participation increase in the U.S. and blacks, African American. So of that growth, this better distribution of talent and entry in the labor market of women and African American explain 20 to 40% of the growth rate. Okay, so that one, if we were not looking at these kind of things, we would have said, oh, that's total factor productivity. But no, it's simply women entering the labor market, women having chances with their talent to compete. And this is crucial for South Asia. South Asia, labor force participation by women is a quarter. It's the lowest in the whole world, apart from MENA, Middle East and North Africa. So yes, technology, I don't say that technology is not important, but you have a lot of talent that is not utilized in women.
So you mentioned, I mean, for the benefit of our viewers, I mean, the total factor productivity is the residual that is not explained by a growth in inputs of either labor or capital. And in your introduction, you said that you are also very interested in gender issues. And you mentioned about low female labor participation. In Sri Lanka, it's 35%, which is slightly higher than, say, India and Pakistan, it's even low. So what explains that? Is this cultural or are there other factors? Because in East Asia, I'm told that it's 60, 70 and Vietnam is like close to 80%.
Sure. Yes. Yes, let me say just one more clarification that may be important. That it's not the boost to growth doesn't come simply from having more women working, but it comes from uh, um, a better allocation of talent. Okay, so it's like if everyone starting from the premises that there is a distribution of talent, and that's between men and women is similar. If everything is done by men, you are not allocating well the talent of women. So there is a productivity impact there, not
So
just a size.
okay, the dormant talent
Right,
by
correct.
bringing it into the
And
workforce.
and increase productivity of
Okay.
everyone, because a talented doctor, woman doctor, does better at curing others. So there is an impact for overall productivity. Okay, that's just a clarification. In terms of why they don't participate so much. Well, that's $1 million question, and there are many studies. You start from the recent Nobel Prize of this year. I'm blanking now, but it's talented women economists that have studied the 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 gender inequality in many for many years. She and Bosserup in the 70s, they basically look at female labor participation as development happens, and there is a kind of a U curve of that, which is at low level of development. Um, um, Women tend to participate quite intensively because a lot of them work in rural areas in farming, and they can basically work from home, or the farm is compatible. That type of work is compatible with caring for the children, cooking, etc., and so on. And also there is need to work because they are poor. As income increases, the work is the economy transformed. There are more works in urban areas, more work in manufacturing, and that type of work is more done by men. And there is an income effect, which is they need less money, and so they can stay at home. As income grows further, there is tertiarization of the economy. Women go out and work in offices, which is more permitted, seen better than working in a factory with other men. And so there is again a pickup of occupation. Now, if you have this U curve and you place all the countries along this curve, and you focus on South Asia, they are all below the curve. So the level of development is not enough to explain why they are below where you expect to. And to explain that gap, there are many different possible things, but we have been beginning to look seriously at social norms, and measuring them is difficult because you don't have only to measure what you think is the right thing to do, or the expected thing to do, but you have to also to measure what you think others think is the good behavior. So you have to measure the first order belief and the second order belief, and that has been done. We have done so in Nepal, we're on the field in Bangladesh and in Pakistan. We may have as well do it in Sri Lanka. I don't think Sri Lanka has such conservative views, but that's a piece of the puzzle that we're trying to get more evidence. Let me, since this is a very passionate theme for me, say one thing. An experiment has been done in Saudi Arabia, where the experiment was this: that a group of Saudi Arabian men has been asked, "What do you think about your wife going to work for pay?" And most interviewed men said, "Well, I'm fine with that." And then the second question: "What do you think 10 peers of yours, 10 neighbors, 10 colleagues, 10 friends would think of your wife?" And the answer is no, 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 they wouldn't think it's a good thing. So there is this gap, but actually they asked all the peers, and all the peers have the same opinion as the first one. So the experiment is that a group has been told, no, you're wrong. Your peers think like you, think there is no problem. And another group has not, the control has not been told them. In the next step was, after receiving this information, they were asked, would you like to enroll your wife in a job portal to get a job? And there is a difference between the two groups. The control didn't see any difference, and the treated group, the one that received information, there is a difference. So this to say that when you manipulate social norms, they have a causal effect. So it's not just something that has a correlation. In this case, there is a causal effect. So you change the norms and there is increase in participation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's a very good example of randomized control trials.
Correct. By Leo Bernstein in Chicago, right. Professor at Chicago.
There was also a poverty lab, right, by Abhijit.
Yeah, they do a lot. Well, they won the Nobel Prize with Esther Duflo. And
have you used that in your work?
Well, we have used it. Yes, we are running experiments in Bangladesh and Pakistan. In Pakistan, we are running an experiment of providing a subsidy to firms that we nudge them towards hiring women, because there is not only the supply side difficulty of participating, the family, your husband, yourself not willing to go, the supply side, but also firms discrimination. Firms believe that women basically are coming, then they're leaving because they want babies. So there are other issues. And so we try on the supply side, on the demand side, on the firms to nudge that. And we have positive results there, especially firms that hire only men, fully male. We have some impact, and they hire women, and we're trying to measure also if they change opinion about women once they have experienced that. And in Bangladesh, we do something different. We look at one of these job portal for domestic workers. So it's like a Uber of domestic workers, and we try to see that, which are all women in Dhaka, and we try to see whether being exposed to this type of job portal, which guarantees a bit better treatment, salaries from the employer, improves their conditions. So again, there we have a treated and a control group, and things are positive there as well.
On staying on the same subject, I mean, if you look at a country like India, which is pretty large geographically and population.
In Sri Lanka, sorry to interrupt. In Sri Lanka, we have another one on with Pikmi on tuk-tuk. Okay. And again, there is some positive.
That is to have female drivers.
There is some positive result done by the IFC, my colleague at IFC, that increased the mobility of women because of tuk-tuk female drivers. Yes.
I think anecdotally we can agree with that.
Yes.
That for sure it has been. And also another observation, actually, Advocata is looking into this about mobility, right, and the two-wheelers, because it was a very Southeast Asian phenomenon where you have females driving two-wheelers, but now it is getting established in Sri Lanka. Right. And you see that more women are moving around on two-wheelers, and that has increased the opportunity. Coming back to my question about India being such a large country, have you seen differences in female labor participation across the countries? And is there a differential between urban households and rural households?
Yes. Yes, we have looked into that, starting from the national level. India is one country which has shown decreasing female labor participation during a period of sustained growth, so really going the wrong direction, and a period during which fertility has been coming down fairly strongly. So there are many papers written on this. What I can say that I have been involved more directly is that we have seen an increase in female labor force participation on urban areas, or at least, let me put it this way, we have seen a premium on intergenerational mobility for girls versus boys in urban areas versus rural areas. That means that women have improved their ranking in the distribution, in general, more in urban areas than in rural areas. But in urban areas, there is a premium vis-a-vis men, boys. And now that's a fact that we have measured. I don't know if you're familiar with the work done by Chetty in intergenerational mobility in the US, the American Dream, etc. So that's a kind of the same measurement. See whether
Raj Shetty, right?
Raj Chetty, whether you move, you're coming from your parents are in the bottom 50% of education, whether you come out higher education. So that's the measure, that the output that we're looking at. And we observe that there is a premium for women in India in urban areas. And now we are figuring out what is behind it. Well, one is demand side. There are more jobs than in rural areas for women. The other one could be norms. They are a little bit less conservative in urban areas than rural areas. Marriage market could be another one. What we observe, that this is ongoing work, so I cannot be completely certain yet, but what we observe is that the education premium is higher for women in urban areas. So there is the fact getting an education pays off slightly more women than men in urban areas. So that's one reason. But there is no demand side. So there is no, when you observe employment, is not so much better. The opportunity of employment is not so much better for women than men in urban areas vis-a-vis relatively to rural. And so why are they getting this education if they cannot use it? And one other area that we're looking at is the marriage market. There has been an increase in the premium of the marriage market. So now women, to get a husband that earns better, has to have more education. That's the one other part. I don't have yet that result, but that's one area we're looking at. So it's
Very interesting.
It's fascinating stuff.
Yes, fascinating. So moving on, you talked about climate risk, and I think the World Bank also brought out a report and said Sri Lanka is highly vulnerable to climate risk. And in your presentation, you talked about South Asia. Why is South Asia specifically more exposed to climate risk?
Well, okay, so let's think about two things. One is the exposure. I basically think is just a geography situation. So there are many areas in South Asia that are exposed to flooding from both the sea rise or rivers. So that's just geography. Think of the Maldives, a country that existentially is menaced by that. I think last time I was in Sri Lanka was in 2005 after the tsunami, and you didn't expect that to arrive from me. So it's just geography and not great fortune in that sense. There are other advantages, obviously, but that exposes with the greenhouse with the increase in temperature. Flooding is a big risk, and this region is exposed. But there is also another more, it's also man-made, the first one, but another one where perhaps the region could do more, which is the infrastructure, the protecting infrastructure and the adaptation to climate change. That depends on actual behavior and decision taken by the country and the population. The fact that if you see the natural disaster, not only affect more these countries, but affect more poorer people in these countries. And so, because poorer people have less opportunity to protect themselves, to move, to migrate is also one other adaptation way of avoiding problems. So there are two things. One, that is more difficult to do anything unless we talk about the global level, reducing increase in temperature, but the region could mitigate the bad impact by adaptation. And so it's more under control of the region. And it tends to be distributionally not neutral, the impact. So the poorer pay a higher price.
So you also highlight about the investment trends, and you are showing that this is not uniform across South Asia, that certainly in India there is a significant growth in public investment, and we see in the media about the large scale infrastructure projects that are being done in India. But in some countries, public investment is falling, like in Sri Lanka, because of the fiscal constraints. And then you have very different behavior for private investment. So, is there a causal link between these two, or do they operate independently?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not aware of, on the top of my head, of any exact study that looks into that. But for sure, and in general economics terms, government public investment should be focused on providing public goods. And once you have more public goods, which are infrastructure most of the time, transportation, education, health system, etc., that attracts private investment in the longer term. So that is the link that I can see. At the cyclical level, I'm not sure of any specific relationship that links the two. It's possible that you have unfortunately during crisis the public investment is the first to go, but that has potentially impact 2, 3, 4, 5 years later on the private investment. So there may be also links at the cyclical level, but I wouldn't dare to say more for now on this.
If you're familiar with the growth diagnostic framework and the concept of a binding constraint, is infrastructure binding constraint generally in South Asia to growth?
Well, it's potentially we have to see, because infrastructure is so large a concept that we should distinguish that a little bit. So if you think, let's think for a moment about a trendy one, digital infrastructure, right? So there is a lot of hype in the region and outside the region that this is a game changer. Now, again, we have looked into this, and it's true. We have done several studies about e-commerce platform, and whether firms that enter e-platforms, enter the digital marketplace, improve their own business in terms of expanding themselves, in terms of size, products, and reach in the market. And indeed, what you observe is that yes, it is the case, and small and large firms take advantage of this. So digital e-commerce can be a good boost for the economy in this region. Now, when you talk about to the e-commerce provider, the platform themselves, they have issue of, as I mentioned, of power outages. They have issues about um, reaching broadband speed across. So there are stumbling block on the digital infrastructure, and the governments are doing investment there. So that's one. On transport, I mentioned transport. There is still more work to do in terms of management of waterways, rivers. I was with my colleagues from water that they try to do investment and lending in that sector. It's very complicated. A lot of big rivers in the region cross across multiple countries. So a lot of these, one last thing I say is that these infrastructure in the region is also hampered by these not intensive integration at the region level. So we talked about low intra-region trade. Similarly, for big energy, transport, irrigation, water, all of these are much better tackled at a wide scale, and that's one limitation in the region. That
You also touched on a point that is very sensitive to Sri Lanka, because we have experienced the debt default and the debt crisis. But you also, if you keep Sri Lanka aside, because we know how the story ended, and I'm afraid that it's yet not over, because private external creditor negotiations are still not finalized and it's dragging on. But you say this is a problem in the other countries in South Asia also, that the debt is rising. And are they coming to a point where the debt is rising faster than their capacity to sustain the debt?
well, again, it depends a bit on which country you look at. Poonam Gupta from India came a month ago to present that sustainability paper that she did on India, and pointed out that yes, it has been increasing. It has reached a certain level that are potentially alarming, but there are a lot of um, details about that that are important for its sustainability. Is mostly in rupees, is mostly very long term. The maturity are long, and it's all mostly domestic. And so I would say that the sustainability depends on the details, the structure of the debt, and the growth environment, the overall growth environment. So once so saying a blanket statement that the debt is not sustainable in the region is not really possible. You have to look at case by case, category of debt by category of debt, and the growth environment in which they are looked at. So that's my assessment.
The way we overcame our debt issues, which has been there in Sri Lanka for a while, for a few decades, is we used to inflate it away.
Right.
But recently, we have brought in a new law for the central bank that explicitly prohibits monetary financing. Of course, they were given a transition period, but since we are in an IMF program, there's a continuous monitoring criteria. Do you know how many other central banks in South Asia have explicit prohibitions against monetary financing?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure. I don't have the exact data on that, but I do believe that most countries have fairly strong independent central banks that are most likely against this monetization of the fiscal deficit. So, and it's well known that that is a problem, but it becomes, again, as I was showing in terms of the fiscal rule, you can even have the rule, but then you have to have the political will and capacity and counterbalancing weight that even if the Ministry of Finance wants to monetize that, the central bank governor won't. and the president doesn't allow that, or depends on the structure of power, because you can put this in writing, but then if there is no political will, I showed some graph that the fiscal rules are broken, and so. And you shouldn't take advice from an Italian, because in the 70s and 80s we inflated our way out of debt, and we are one of the countries with the highest debt level in Europe. So anyway,
was South Asia's growth, was there a fiscal impulse going on? Was it getting stimulated fiscally besides the COVID era, where there was stimulus, but previously was there a lot of fiscal stimulus going on
in South Asia in general?
In general, yeah. Because what I saw in some of your graphs is there's a lot of transfer payments going on even in India. I think there was a recent IMF article on this. I'm sorry, Economist article on this.
Okay.
That there was a lot of subsidies being transferred. They were looking at different governments in India.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, there has been a strong accommodative stance of fiscal policy during the COVID and post-COVID, clearly. But your question was before COVID. What is? Yeah, although I think there has been some of that in terms of well, you mentioned transfers for anti-poverty transfer, etc. But I doubt that a lot of the growth that we have observed comes from fiscal stimulus. The size of the government in terms of both revenues and expenditure is it's relatively contained in this region. So you have the extreme case of revenue being below 7% in Sri Lanka because of the crisis, but they don't go beyond 10-15% the size of revenues in any of these countries. And so with that kind of revenues, you can't stimulate too much the economy. So there's a structural, and that is also a problem in raising more revenues, because there is the public doesn't see what do I get for the taxation. The large informality is also related to low revenues to GDP ratios. So I don't think that there is a large fiscal maneuver to stimulate the growth. The growth comes more from, as I said before, demographic integration, technological change, and these kind of things in the long term for the region.
Lastly, about the environmental issues and the green transition, it was interesting you mentioned about this experiment that you did in Bangladesh with the motor. So what you're basically saying is the perceived benefits are a lot lower than the actual benefits. Right. That the actual benefits. So what you're basically telling policymakers is that there has to be a greater effort in bridging that gap between perception and what you can really gain, right? So do you think part of that is incentives, that maybe energy is priced too cheaply, and that many businesses are not trying hard enough, basically?
Yes, indeed. No, of course. The price signal is one of the things that I also mentioned, and it's wrong in most of the region. The subsidy, one part of the stimulus that we were discussing a moment ago, is that it's a wrong stimulus to use too much energy and indeed that is wrong. But there is also another reason behind this, that is we begin to study a bit better why they do make these mistakes in the perception of the benefit. What is the formation of this perception, of this belief, come from where? Are they just not reading the newspaper or not being educated, or are they operating in, especially smaller firms, are operating in a highly difficult environment with a lot of shocks and very little buffer? So for them, even buying a motor, the electric motor that is efficient, can be, for small firms, can be a fairly large investment, and they don't have that buffer, and so and they face constant risk. So there are other reasons. So information, as you pointed out, and as I pointed out, is certainly important. Giving demonstration, and it's cheap to do this information campaign, and they work. But there are other issues as well that are environmental, macroeconomic risk, etc., that are important to take into account when they form these wrong perceptions about advantages.
So, if you were a classic question is, if you were government and you're given the option between subsidizing the cost of electricity or subsidizing the motor, which one should they do?
No, they should find a way to improve the adoption of efficient motors. Yes, which subsidy could be one way, as we show in this experiment. It works. There may be other ways, but probably that adoption of better technology is the way to go,
But
rather than
what you say, the existing price signals are sufficient incentive to do it, but it's just the ignorance or the gap between the perception, the actual, that is holding back.
yeah, I don't know if I would call it ignorance, but
Or the access to capital to do it.
access to capital could be one. The reduction of risk, one being, rather than making them pay less electricity, give them electricity constant. The reliability of the power grid. So that would be another one. When they don't rely on that, they buy a technology that is an efficient generator, right? And so they can't use this motor in the case of Pakistan, of Bangladesh experiment. So yes, I would move away from subsidizing energy and sending price signals towards adopting better technology that is saving energy.
Finally, a very interesting point you came about green jobs.
Yes.
And you said that firms where there is greater energy efficiency and where there is more green jobs, there is a higher labor intensity.
Right.
Right. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, yeah. I haven't participated directly in that study, but I'm not sure there was a clear cut mechanism explaining this, but I would dare to say that so this was an observation that when you follow firms and you distinguish them between firms that adopt energy saving technology versus those that don't, the first one that adopt expands their level of employment.
So maybe they're more competitive.
So yes, I was going there. So they are more competitive. The fact that they adopt a better technology is that they are growth forecast for themselves is positive. They are venturing. They have potentially a better managerial capacity to foresee the future and the path towards that, and therefore become more competitive and expand, and therefore employment is the natural consequences of expanding, right? So, but I should go and check exactly the mechanism. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Maurizio Bussolo, thank you very much for this fascinating conversation.
Thank you very much for having me.